Hello, everybody. Welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well. Today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Inside Out 2 in only its third week of release finally cross the $1 billion mark. This is something that I was projecting last weekend was going to happen by the end of this weekend. If you look at my article for geeksgamers.com, and I talked about how this was likely going to happen, and sure enough, it did with ease. And right now, this film is easily tracking to end probably somewhere in that 1.2 to 1.4 billion-dollar range, a major success for Disney, which has had several years now of unmitigated disaster after unmitigated disaster. This is definitely the kind of news that they want to be seeing, not only a film breaking even, making profit, crossing $1 billion, but also a film that actually will be able to maybe make up for some of the massive losses. Now, we're not anywhere close to making those losses up yet because we're talking about losses near $1 billion, even just from the likes of films last year alone with how much money they spent and how little they got back in return. But we are also, obviously going to be honest here and say, they're still taking a pretty big chunk, with them now making roughly $200 million in net gain profits. So we're talking about taking into account the splits domestic, international, and from China, taking into account the typical marketing cost, taking into account the $200 million reported budget. So unless the budget is higher than $200 million, which right now there seems to be no indication that that's going to be something that gets changed down the line. Usually the films that get changed are their live action fare. Normally the projected and estimated budgets for those films tend to not actually change from the likes of Disney Pixar or from the likes of even Disney Animated Studios, or Disney Animation, I should say. Those tend to stay pretty standard, tend to stay pretty stable. But again, facts still remain what they are, and this is definitely a big win for them, especially as they are now just a couple of weeks away from the next major film that they have coming out, which is, of course, Deadpool & Wolverine, which is itself poised to not only have a better opening, even domestically, than Inside Out 2, but based on the tracking, will probably end up being a bigger film. And as a rated R film, to be doing better, or at least having projections to do better than a PG film, right? A PG film, which is typically open to a lot more audience. It says quite a lot about how popular that film is going to be. Now, does this mean that Disney is back, though? I obviously would say, don't get your hopes up. And again, Tony's going to say some things that I think are a little bit too preemptive at this point in time, but we'll talk about all those things before, as we go through this video today. Before any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button. Also, light up the fire button on Aussie, smash the rumble button as well. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit that bell so that way you get notified every time there's a new video or live stream on the channel. So Nancy, good old Nance over at Deadline, has the story for us. Inside Out 2, out of this world, as the sequel crosses 1 billion. And as the claim here is, it's the fastest animated movie to ever hit the milestone. Now, I'm just going to pause right there and just remind Nancy and remind everyone watching that, okay, whenever they're going to try to bring out new records being broken by any film, this is not just Disney, you always take it with a giant grain of salt, because they never account for inflation, they never account for the change in ticket prices, and though it is definitely a good sign, it is definitely a huge win for Disney to have a film cross $1 billion, especially one that they have now, again, easily made their money back on, because typically they've had even films in the past, films like Rise of Skywalker, for instance, which, yeah, the film crossed $1 billion, but guess what? Because of how much money that film cost to actually make, they didn't make anything. They actually lost $100 million on that movie. So $1 billion in and of itself is not always a guarantee of anything. It depends on how much you are actually spending. But I do bring up the fact that, again, Nancy, Tony, all of these Hollywood shills, they tend to leave out the facts. They tend to leave out those adjustments for inflation, those changes to ticket prices, which I imagine would probably change the dynamic of this quite a bit. I imagine there's probably some films that would have been reaching this milestone a little bit faster, but again, not going to take anything away. This is still very, very strong numbers, and for it to have reached $1 billion 3 weeks into its release, it's not just good by Disney standards, it's good by most standards today, okay? So definitely very strong numbers here, and we cannot take anything away. And a huge part of this has actually been driven by a very strong domestic market, really showing up in force for this movie and having strong holds from week to week. It goes on to say here, there's joy all around at Disney Pixar Society 2 has crossed the the coveted $1 billion milestone with $1,014 million through 19 days. This is the quickest time to the mark for an animated movie ever, besting the previous record holder Frozen 2, which got there in 25. Now, just as a reminder, you have to go back to, 2019 for Frozen 2, which means ticket prices were a good almost $2, $3, $4 less expensive back then, right? There's been a huge increase in ticket prices since that time, not to mention also, again, the rate of inflation changing too. So I think that you're probably looking at these films, if not being on par, then Frozen 2 having the slight edge there. I don't have those numbers right in front of me to give you off the, because again, those are going a little bit too specific there. But I do, again, always like to point out the fact that when it comes to these numbers, when it comes to these types of records, it typically is something that is just completely nonsensical and just, again, leaves out a lot of very important information. But again, headline is what's right now important, and that is that the film reached $1 billion. Even Tony, of course, is talking about this film, but he's also talking about A Quiet Place Day One, saying it's easily scaring up $53 million. And here is where that information I just gave you is going to be very important, right? About why context matters, why history matters, why ticket prices, rate of inflation matters. He says here, $53 million franchise opening record. Inside Out 2, though, has the last laugh with a third number one at 57 plus million. So, again, Inside Out 2 definitely continuing its dominance at that number one spot, especially domestically. But you have here yet another misconception, another lie, another, trying to say, hey, look at this hand over here, while I just ignore important key information over there. And that's him saying it's a franchise record for the Quiet Place franchise. Now, again, this is a lot better than the initial projections. We're talking about $10 million more domestically than what was the initial anticipation. Worldwide, the film has actually already gotten close to around $100 million. So by the time the actuals come in on Tuesday, Wednesday, we might actually even see it creep up to $100 million, obviously adding in Monday numbers there. But the reason why that it's so important to call this out, as we will have right here, and this is something we've talked about in the past, and this is something that I shared on social media, and that is, okay, what does this actually look like, though, compared to previous movies? So A Quiet Place Day One, again, better than projections, definitely strong in today's market, no doubt about that. I think the chances of it breaking even are definitely there. It still has a ways to go in order to actually do that, but is definitely off to a good start, a better than expected start, and a start that it would much rather see as a franchise, much rather see in today's world than what we've seen from previous films, other previous franchise films from earlier in the year, especially looking at films like Furiosa, for instance. But $53 million is what right now is the projected opening domestic weekend for this third film in the franchise. Now, if you go back in time to the second film, back in 2021, guess what? That film, actually, when you adjust for inflation, was $55 million. You go all the way back to the first film in 2018, that film, when adjusted, is around $61 million. If you get triggered by inflation, okay, let's take into account ticket sales. All right, if you take into account the average ticket price back in 2018, 2021, 2024, it looks something like this. 5.5 million tickets sold for the first film, 4.5 million for the second film, and then 4 million for the third film. So this is definitely one of the better ones that we have seen. Obviously, Inside Out 2 was one of those very rare exceptions where the sequel actually, in so many ways, outshined even that of the original, even when you do adjust for things like inflation or adjust for things like ticket prices. We'll actually pull it up right now, right? It was around 154 million when everything was said and done. So that's 11.8 million tickets versus 10.7 for the original from 2015, 117 million adjusted for inflation versus 154 in today's dollars. And so, again, that's an example of one doing better, but Quiet Place is definitely in a better position than, again, films like Furiosa. We're talking about millions of less tickets for that film versus the previous film in the franchise. This one is a lot more close, right? 53 versus 55 versus 61. We're not talking about a whole lot of difference there. 5.5 versus 4.5 versus 4. Not a lot of difference there, but I bring it up because this lie being perpetrated that this is the best opening of the franchise is just on paper not realistic. It's actually the weakest opening of the franchise. It's actually the worst opening of the franchise, not by much, but still, on paper, looking at the actual numbers, looking at real data, it is indeed still the lowest, right? That's still about 500,000 less tickets being sold for this movie domestically in its opening. Now, as I mentioned, because of it doing so much better than projections, the initial projections were actually going to indicate it being closer to 1 million less people going to see it. When you're talking about low numbers, right, about 4 or 5 million people, 1 million is a lot, right? 500,000 is still nothing to snuff at, right? That's still percentage-wise a pretty significant drop, but definitely a better situation than what the initial anticipated initial estimates were going into it. But I do want to point that out because, again, Tony's not going to talk about that. He's just going to say record here, record there, record there. It's like, yeah, it's not really fair, especially when you look at ticket prices, especially when you think about inflation. It's like, yeah, you really can't compare these films to other films unless you're going to put them on equal playing field. And the only way you can do that is either by adjusting for inflation or looking at average tickets and trying to come up with ticket sale estimates. So the big story, though, of course, and we'll dive into the actual numbers on my RCC chart. This is going to be the standard chart that I use from this point going forward. And I do have here a column that goes into what the typical 2.5 multiplier gain loss on a given film would be. But it also has the much more realistic take of, okay, 55% domestic, 40% international, without China. China, 25% specifically, right? And these are the numbers that we're currently looking at. So for A Quiet Place Day 1, again, very, very strong start here, $98.5 million worldwide. But if you look at these numbers, as you can see, it's about still $53 million in actual losses, right? If a 2.5 multiplier were at play, right, this would have been prior to the pandemic, before a lot of the contracts changed, the relationship between theaters and studios changed, it would have been around 41 million in the red still. So definitely not the best ever that you could ever think of, but definitely also on its pathway to being able to break even, with especially a large portion of it coming from the domestic market. Here, again, about $53 million, $45.5 million coming from the international. And as of right now, nothing being reported out of China, but still very, very strong start for this movie. And if the film is able to hold strong, and this is going to be the key point, right? And this is always the key point for all films, but especially for this one, because if this film has a strong hold from week 1 to week 2, especially domestically, there's a good chance for this film to possibly get close to its break even by the end of next weekend. But at the very least, we could have a pretty strong confidence that it'll actually break even, make some profit. In fact, maybe even make enough profits to be able to pay for another film in the future, with this movie itself causing an estimated $67 million, meaning a break even, right? In the past, a typical break even would have been around 167.5. So getting close to 100 million then in your opening weekend is definitely a much better place that you would want to be in. But also remembering that in today's world, those differences, what you get, the take that you get from the different markets is definitely something that is not going to be what we typically would imagine it to be. Again, Quiet Place Day 1, though, seemingly doing pretty well here. Going to Horizon and American Saga Chapter 1, on the other hand, not looking all that good, right? So the domestic right now for the film is projected to be around $11 million. Those are the only numbers that were being reported right now. That's about where the initial estimates for the weekend were coming in. But remembering this film costs about $50 million, right? Part 1 and Part 2, I believe, were both made around the same time. So it was around $100 million sunk into both of them. So if you split that evenly, it's about 50-50. So $50 million for the first part, $50 million for the second part. $50 million of Kevin Costner's own money was put into this 3-hour part 1 epic, right? Of actually all the films that have been made so far, but $50 million of his own money. And as of right now, it's not looking great, okay? This film really needed to have a much higher than expected opening. And right now, it's just not showing that. So unless we see some type of major hold from week to week to week, even just from the next several days, these first initial days when word of mouth is so important, so vital for the long-term health of a movie release. If we don't start to see that, if we don't see that at all for this movie, yeah, things are not going to be looking good for any of these projects to actually be completed. I think Part 1, Part 2 are completed. I think that the success of both of these parts is going to ultimately determine whether or not the last 1 or 2 parts get completed, if memory serves. But it's right now not looking all that great, because this film not looking like it's going to make any money with only $11 million domestic. But end of next weekend, we'll have a much better idea. And remember, worldwide, typically most films make about 30% of their entire box office in their global opening. No global money for this yet, no international money being reported. Could be delayed releases in different parts of the country as well, different parts of the world, I should say, which means that you might see this film have legs down the road. But seeing that this is an American story, I doubt it's going to be appealing to many audiences outside of the United States. And so I will just say right now, it's looking like that's going to be a flop for Kevin Costner and for everyone else involved. We do have some 2-week numbers, some second weekend numbers to talk about when it comes to the Bike Riders. So this film now at $23.6 million worldwide. So we're looking at it still around $48 million in the red. So I'm thinking this film will probably end up being a loss of somewhere between we actually have some projections here. So you can see based off of the week 2 numbers, okay, so the international, the global numbers, $23.6 million after 2 weeks, projecting the film to make somewhere between $33 and $47 million worldwide. We really didn't see a good strong hold for this film. It dropped about 66% from week 1 to week 2 domestically, and that is just not a good sign, right? This is a good movie. This is a film that I think is arguably one of the best films so far to come out this year. And so being a good film, no one going to see it really opening weekend, and now seeing a major loss like this, right, seeing a major drop-off in the second weekend, it's not looking like the word of mouth is really helping this film all that much. It's not looking like this is going to be able to bring out the kind of audience it would need to make up even its much smaller $40 million budget. So that's why, again, using traditional 2.5 multiplier, projected losses being somewhere between $39 and $31 million, taking a more realistic approach, right? The actual splits that you typically see in today's world, and also the fact that most of the money, luckily for this film, good case scenario for this film, most of that money will be coming from the domestic market. We're probably seeing this film actually get losses probably closer to $35 to $40 million. So a little bit on the higher end there. But as you can see, because of where it's making its money, it's not as big of a difference between what the actual gain loss is right now versus what it would have been just as a few years ago when the deals were a little bit different because of, again, day and date releases and streaming on VOD and all these other things, right? These contracts impacting the total box office as we see it. So those are the numbers as they stand. And I just realized right now, again, we love doing things live here. I didn't go to the numbers.com to show you the top 5 for this weekend. So we'll go ahead and do that before we end this video. So Inside Out 2, 43% drop from week 1 to week 2. Sorry, week 2 to week 3, I should say. So very strong numbers, well on its way to $500 million domestic. Again, Disney hasn't had one of those in quite a long time. This is probably the best performance they've had, especially from a Disney Pixar film, since Frozen 2 back in 2019. So it's been a long time since they have had any type of financial success, especially at the box office. A Quiet Place Day 1, not to be outdone though, had actually a better per theater ratio in its first opening weekend, right? The first weekend of its release, $53 million. So we see a kind of a battle going on between the third weekend of Inside Out 2 and the opening weekend of A Quiet Place. And though The Quiet Place did come out much higher than initial projections were, Inside Out 2 is still dominating everything at the box office. Horizon American Saga, $11 million, only $3,300 per screen. So again, just not anywhere close to, remember, that's a 3-hour movie. Just as part 1 alone is a 3-hour film. So this is going to be a much harder film to sell. But if we don't see a strong hold next weekend, I'm going to have to say, it doesn't look like this franchise is going to be happening at this point. Bad Boys Ride or Die dropping 45% in its 4th week of release. Based on the numbers actually for this movie, for anyone who is interested, it actually has still not broken even yet. So using the actual gain loss because of how much money. All right, we're looking close to a 50-50 split between what it's made domestically versus what it's made internationally. So it's still about $7.1 million in the... Actually, sorry, my bad. It actually finally has making money. Let me correct the record. That's why we do things live here, so that way I keep myself honest. So I have the chart here. I have the column here set to where it should be putting that into changing that from red to black. But as you can see, because there's no negative sign there, it is indeed 7.1 million profit. So congratulations, Bad Boys Ride or Die has finally started to make profits. So even though many people have said the box office has been amazing for this film, again, it's been good, but it's only just now making profits. And so we're looking at probably the end result being, what, 25 to 50 maybe in net gain profit. That's a good thing, obviously, but it also doesn't pay for a future project in and of itself. So we obviously are looking at these numbers saying, okay, they're definitely good. It's always good to be on the positive end to make your money back, but still not quite where it would need to be a huge box office hit. Garfield film, $19.4 million in net gain profits for that movie. $174 million in losses still for Furiosa. So that film, again, guaranteed flop. The Watchers also looking to be a guaranteed flop as well. And let's see, IF, obviously we've talked about that film before, being a box office flop. Even the film Sight, right, $8 million of a loss there. And I'm trying to see if there's any other films that we were talking about. Yes, Kingdom Planet of the Apes. This is another film, actually still a financial failure. So getting close to $400 million worldwide doesn't matter because of how much money they spent. Still might be something that Disney makes money on because of how they were a distributor primarily on the film, and they split the production cost with others, but still not on in and of itself a film that has made money as an individual film itself. Even The Fall Guy as well, even though that film was well received by a lot of people, just did not make much money anywhere in the world, and so ended up being a financial loss as well. But those are the numbers as they stand. So what are y'all's thoughts? Do you think that we're going to see A Quiet Place Day 1 be able to make its money back? Right now, it seems like those numbers, those opening weekend numbers, are definitely a good sign, showing some health there. But I mentioned before in the very beginning of the video that Tony was going to say another big whopper that I was going to have to, kind of go after here. And let me see if I can find it. It says here, still, it couldn't be clearer that we are out of the dog days of the strike-impacted box office with a consistent supply of event films, many of which are over-indexing. Okay, so then what happened with Furiosa, Tony? See, this is the problem that I have with these mainstream media pundits, right? Not only do they lie, making up new records or false records, they really are falsifying records in so many different ways, right? But then they also come up with whoppers like this when they say, oh yeah, the whole strike thing, and that's totally why the box office is failing, by the way. It was because of the strike. That's the only reason why it was failing. It wasn't because of the movies coming out. It wasn't because of the lack of interest or anything like that. I mean, it honestly is silly. And so don't be surprised if we start to see some other films coming out that are going to now be over projected and then coming in underneath because, yeah, people are still not quite back into the movie-going thing. So I think right now the thing driving people out is Inside Out 2. But as we learned from last year, right? Remember when we had Barbie? Remember how we had Barbenheimer? Right? That brought people out to the theater, but there were a lot of other films last year that did not bring them out. So using the strike as an excuse is just so old at this point, and trying to say that now we're past those dog days, it'll be very fun to see what excuse he comes up with when there is the next box office flop to come out, which again, there's going to be more coming out this year because the box office still has not fully recovered. These are very good signs. Ultimately, these are good for the theater, right? People coming out for A Quiet Place, people coming out for Inside Out 2, eventually coming out for Deadpool. Those are very good things for the theater, very good things for them, but got to keep it real, Tony. Got to keep it honest. But what are y'all's thoughts about that? And also, how much money do you think we're going to see for Inside Out 2? Do you think it's going to get to 1.2 billion, 1.4 billion? What do you think? And also, what do you think that the end result of Deadpool is going to be? If the film is good, if it's even decent, I think we're looking at a film probably getting 1.3, 1.4 billion as a rated R movie, possibly even being one of the most successful rated R runs at the box office that we've ever seen. Kind of crazy when you think about it, right? About where we are at the box office, where we are, and also how powerful the marketing has really been for that movie. And I think Disney's probably not going to be taking that the way that they should, looking at it really as being solid gold when probably for them, much more like fool's gold, because they still have a lot of projects coming out that don't have a lot of interest and probably are not going to drive people out to the box office, or in the case of the upcoming Captain America film, are costing them so much money that even if it did somehow make $1 billion, would still end up being a financial loss for them. So let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, loud that fire button, honestly, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all very much for putting up with me being absent. For the last several days, I was on a trip with my family to go see family in Oklahoma, in Missouri, and it was a very fun trip. Had its moments, of course, when you have two kids in the van, but overall, it was very good. I'm back, though, back to doing regular scheduled videos and streams, and I cannot wait to jump back into it and have those conversations with all of you. So have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Sunday, and as always, God bless. And now for a huge special shout out to all of my Patreon, Subscribestar, Locals, and YouTube members who are at the Chosen of Valhalla level. Starting off with my Patreon supporters, Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, which is Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. To my Subscribestar Chosen members, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name, and also the K-Man, check him out at xtheboundaries.co, and a shout out also to my one Chosen of Valhalla YouTube member, Mr. Roy. Thank you again for being so much of a huge supporter of the channel. And to every one of my chosen members, if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want access to things like giveaways of Blu-rays, 4Ks, etc., and access to an exclusive podcast bonus material for members, check out the links in the video description below for all of those details. You guys are amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed month of the Sacred Heart, and as always, God bless.